Hey guys, welcome back. I know it's been a little while since the last one. With my new schedule, I'm only able to record a video once a week. But what I'm going to do is kind of change things up just a little bit. And I'm going to start recording these videos and probably hopefully less than a half hour. So that means the chapters will be split in half. It's a lot on my throw mouth to have to speak for a whole hour, number one. Number two, it just takes up a lot of your day, have to record for an hour, and then takes sometimes 3 or 4 hours to upload. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and cut these in half. But other than that, hope you guys did enjoy the last one, and are looking forward to see what this next chapter has to bring us. So Chapter 8, We Take Nothing by Conquest, Thank God. Colonel Ethan Alec Hitchcock, a professional soldier, graduate of the military academy, commander of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, a reader of Shakespeare, Chaucer, Hegel, Spinoza, wrote in his diary. Fort Jessup, L.A., June 30th, 1845. Orders came last evening by express from Washington City Directing General Taylor to move without any delay to some point on the coast, near the Sabine or elsewhere, and as soon as he shall hear of the acceptance by the Texas Convention of the annexation resolutions of our Congress, he is immediately to proceed with his whole command to the extreme western border of Texas, and take up a position on the banks of or near the Rio Grande. And he has to expel any armed force of Mexicans who may cross the river. Bliss read the orders to me last hastily a tattoo. I have scarcely slept a wink, thinking of the needful preparations. I am now noticing a revival by candlelight and waiting the signal for master. Violence leads to violence, and if this movement of ours does not lead to others, and to bloodshed, I am much mistaken. Hitchcock was not mistaken. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase had doubled the territory of the United States, extending it to the Rocky Mountains, to the southwest Mexico, which had won its independence in a Revolutionary War against Spain in 1821. Which, fun fact, a lot of South American countries, South Mexico, a lot of them regained their independence from Spain around 1821. A large country included Texas and what are now New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, California, and part of Colorado. After agitation and aid from the United States, Texas broke off from Mexico in 1836 and declared itself the Lone Star Republic. In 1845, the U.S. Congress brought into the United States as a union. In the White House now was James Polk, a Democrat, an expansionist who, on the night of his inauguration, confided to his Secretary of the Navy that one of his many objectives was the acquisition of California. His order to General Taylor to move troops to the Rio Grande was a challenge to the Mexicans. It was not all clear that the Rio Grande was the southern territory of Texas, although Texas had forced to defeat Mexican General Santa Anna to say when he was a prisoner. The traditional border between Texas and Mexico had been the Nueces River, about 150 miles to the north. Both Mexico and the United States had recognized that as the border. However, Polk, encouraging the Texans to accept annexation, had assured them he would uphold their claims to the Rio Grande. Ordering troops to the Rio Grande, into territory inhabited by Mexicans, was clearly a provocation. Taylor had once denounced the idea of the annexation of Texas, but now that he had his marching orders, his attitude seemed to change. His visit to the tent of his aide Hitchcock to discuss the move is described in Hitchcock's diary. He seems to have lost all respect for Mexican rights and is willing to be an instrument of Mr. Polk for pushing our boundary as far west as possible. When I told him that, if he suggested a movement, which he told me he intended, Mr. Polk would seize upon it and throw the responsibility on him. He at once said he would take it, and added that if the President instructed him to use his discretion, he would ask no orders, but would go upon the Rio Grande as he could to get transportation. I think the general wants an additional brevet, and would strain a point to get it. Taylor moved his troops to Corpus Christi, Texas, just across the Nueces River, and waited further instructions. They came in February 1846 to go down to the Gulf Coast to the Rio Grande. Taylor's army marched in parallel columns across the open prairie, scouts far ahead and on the flanks, a train of supplies following. Then along a narrow road, through a belt of thick chaparral, they arrived on March 20th, 1846, at cultivated fields and thatched roof huts hurriedly abandoned by the Mexican occupants. He had fled across to the city of Matamoros. Taylor set up camp, began construction of a fort, and implanted his cannon facting the white houses of Matamoros, whose inhabitants stared curiously at the sight of an army on the banks of a quiet river. The Washington Union, a newspaper expressing the position of President Polk and the Democratic Party, had spoken early in 1845 on the meaning of Texas annexation. The great measure of annexation be accomplished, and with it the questions of boundary and claims. For who can arrest the torrent that will pour onward to the west? The road to California will be open to us, who will stay the march of a Western people. They could have meant a peaceful march westward, etc. Other words in the same newspaper, quote, "A corps of properly organized volunteers would invade, overrun, and occupy Mexico. They would enable us not only to take California, but to keep it." End quote. It was shortly after that, in the summer of 1845. That John O'Sullivan, editor of the Democratic Review, used the phrase that became famous, saying it was, quote, "our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by presidents for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." End quote. Yes, manifest destiny. All that was needed in the spring of 1846 was a military incident to begin the war that Polk wanted. It came in April when General Taylor's quartermaster, Colonel Cross, while riding up the Rio Grande, disappeared. His body was found 11 days later, his skull smashed by a heavy blow. It was assumed he had been killed by Mexican guerrillas crossing the river. At a solemn military ceremony visible to the Mexicans of Matamoros, crowding onto the roofs of their houses across the Rio Grande, Cross was buried with a religious service and 3 volleys of rifle fire. Now, what he means by that is that's something that carries on nowadays when a military veteran or the president dies or someone in office nowadays. They'll do the salute to the military or like a religious prayer and then the firing of the rifles. It's a very common thing nowadays. The next day, April 25, a patrol of Taylor soldiers was surrounded and attacked by Mexicans and wiped out, 16 dead, others wounded, the rest captured. Taylor sent a message to the governors of Texas and Louisiana, asking them to recruit 5,000 volunteers. He had been authorized to do this by the White House before he left for Texas, and he sent a dispatch to Polk, quote, "Hostilities may now be considered commenced." End quote. The Mexicans had fired the first shot, but they had done with what the American government wanted. According to Colonel Hitchcock, who wrote in his diary, even before those first incidents, "I have said from first that the United States are the aggressors. We have not one particular right to be here. It looks as if the government sent a small force on purpose to bring on a war, so as to have a pretext for taking California and much of this country as it chooses. Because of this army, there is no doubt of war between the United States and Mexico. My heart is not in this business, but as a military man, I am bound to executive orders." And before those first clashes, Taylor had sent dispatches to Polk, which led the president to note that, quote, "the probabilities of that hostilities might take place soon," end quote, On May 9th, before news of any battles, Polk was suggesting to his cabinet a declaration of war, based on certain money claims against Mexico, and on Mexico's recent rejection of an American negotiator named John Slidell. Polk recorded in his diary what he said to the cabinet meeting. "I stated that up to this time, as we knew, we had heard of no open act of aggression by the Mexican army, but that the danger was imminent that such acts would be committed, and I said in my opinion we have ample cases of war, and that it was impossible, that I could remain silent much longer, that the country was excited and impatient on the subject." The country was not, quote, excited and impatient, but the president was. When the dispatches arrived from General Taylor, telling of casualties on the Mexican attack, Polk summoned the cabinet to hear the news, and they unanimously agreed he should ask for a declaration of war. Polk's message to Congress was indignant. "The cup of bonds had been exhausted even before the recent information from the frontier of the Del Norte, the Rio Grande. But now, after reiterated menaces, Mexico had passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. As war exists, notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it, exists by the act of Mexico herself, we are called upon by every consideration of duty and patriotism to vindicate with decision the honor, the rights, and the interests of our country." Polk spoke of the dispatch of the American troops to the Rio Grande as a necessary measure of defense. As John Schroeder says, Mr. Polk's war, quote, "Indeed, the reverse was true. President Polk had incited war by sending American soldiers into what was disputed territory, historically controlled and inhabited by Mexicans." Unquote. Congress then rushed to approve the war message. Schroeder comments, quote, "The disciplined Democratic majority in the House responded with alacrity and high-handed efficiency to Polk's May 11th war recommendations." Unquote. The bundles of official documents accompanying the war message, supposedly evidence for Polk's statement, were not examined, but were tabled immediately by the House. Debate on the bill providing volunteers and money for the war was limited to 2 hours, and most of this was used up by reading selected portions of the tabled documents, so that barely half-hour was left for the discussion of the issue. The Whig Party was presumably against the war in Mexico, but it was not against expansion. The Whigs wanted California, but preferred to do it without war. As Schroeder puts it, quote, "Theirs was a commercially oriented expansionism designed to secure frontage on the Pacific without recourse to war." Unquote. Also, they were not so powerfully against the military action that they would stop it by denying men and women the money for their operation. They did not want to risk the accusation that they were putting American soldiers in peril by depriving them of the materials necessary to fight. The result was the Whigs joined Democrats in voting overwhelmingly for the war resolution, 174 to 14. The opposition was a small group of strongly anti-slavery Whigs, or, quote, "a little knot of ultralists," unquote, as one of Massachusetts congressmen who voted for the war measure put it. In the Senate, there was a debate, but it was limited to 1 day, and, quote, "the tactics of stampede were there repeated," unquote. According to historian Frederick Merrick, the war measure passed 40 to 2, Whigs joining Democrats. Throughout the war, Schroeder says, quote, "the politically sensitive Whig minority could only harry the administration with a barrage of verbiage, while voting for every appropriation which the military campaigns required," unquote. The newspaper of the Whigs, the National Intelligencer of Washington, took this position. John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts originally voted with, quote, "the stubborn 14 later voted for war appropriations." Abraham Lincoln of Illinois was not yet in Congress when the war began, but after his election in 1846, he had occasion to vote and speak. On the war. His, quote, "spot resolutions" became famous. He challenged Polk to specify the exact spot where American blood was shed, quote, "on the American soil," but he would not try to end the war by stopping funds for minute supplies. Speaking in the House on July 27, 1848, in support of the candidacy of General Zachary Taylor for president, he said, "But as General Taylor is, par excellence, the hero of the Mexican War, and as you Democrats say we Whigs have always opposed the war, you think it must be very awkward and embarrassing for us to go to war for General Taylor. The declaration that we have always opposed the war is true or false, according as one may understand the term, quote, oppose the war. If to say, quote, the war was unnecessary and unconstitutionally commenced by the President, end quote, by opposing the war, then the Whigs have very generally opposed it, the marching an army into the midst of a peaceful Mexican settlement, frightening the inhabitants of the way, leaving their growing crops and other property unto destruction, and to you may appear a perfectly amicable, peaceful, unprovoking procedure, but it does not appear so to us. But if, when the war had begun, and had become the cause of the country, the giving of our money and our blood, and coming with yours, was support of the war, then it is not true that you have always opposed the war. With few individual exceptions, you have constantly had our votes, here for all the necessary supplies. A handful of anti-slavery congressmen voted against all war measures, seeing the Mexican campaign as a means of extending the southern slave territory. One of these was Joshua Giddings of Ohio. A fiery speaker, physically powerful, called it, quote, an aggressive, unholy, and unjust war, end quote. He explained his vote against supplying arms and men, quote, in the murder of Mexicans upon their own soil, or on robbing them of their crimes must on the others. I will not participate in them, end quote. Giddings pointed out to the British Whigs, who during the American Revolution announced in Parliament in 1776 that they would not vote supplies for a war to oppress Americans. After Congress acted in May of 1846, there were rallies and demonstrations for the war in New York, Baltimore, Indianapolis, Philadelphia, and many other places. Thousands rushed to volunteer for the army. The poet Walt Whitman wrote in the Brooklyn Eagle in the early days of the war, quote, yes, Mexico he must thoroughly chastise. Let our arms now be carried with a spirit which shall teach the world that, while we are not forward for a quarrel, America knows how to crush as well as how to expand. End quote. Accompanying all the aggressiveness was the idea that the United States would be giving the blessings of liberty and democracy to more people. It was intermingling with ideas of racial superiority. Longings for the beautiful lands of New Mexico and California, and thoughts of commercial enterprise across the Pacific. Speaking of California, the Illinois State Register asked, quote, shall the Garden of Beauty be suffered to lie dormant in its wild and useless luxuriance? Myriads of enterprising Americans would flock to its rich and inviting prairies. The hum of Anglo-American industry would be heard in its valleys. Cities would rise upon its plains and sea coasts, and the resources and wealth of the nation be increased in an incalculable degree, end quote. The American Review talked to Mexicans yielding to, quote, a superior population and sensibly oozing into her territories, changing her customs, and now living, out trading, and exterminating her weaker blood, end quote. The New York Herald was saying by 1847, quote, the universal Yankee nation can regenerate and disenthrall the people of Mexico in a few years and lead as a part of our destiny to civilize that beautiful country, end quote. A letter appeared in the New York Journal of Commerce, introducing God into the situation. Quote, the supreme ruler of the universe seems to interpose and need the energy of man towards benefiting mankind. His interposition seems to me to be identified with the success of our arms, that the redemption of 70 million of souls from all the vices that infest the human race, as the ostensible object appears manifest. Senator H.V. Johnson said, quote, I believe shall be reckoned to our noble mission, a fulfilled acquiescence in the high purposes of a wise providence. War has its evils. In all ages it has been the minister of wholesale death and appalling desolation. But however inscrutable, to us it has also been made, by the all-wise dispenser of events, the instrumentality of accomplishing the great end of human elevation and human happiness. It is in the view that I subscribe to the doctrine of human destiny, manifest destiny, end quote. The Congressional Globe of February 11, 1847 reported, Mr. Miles of Maryland, I take it for granted that we shall gain territory and must gain territory before we shut the gates of the Temple of Janus. We must march from ocean to ocean. We must march from Texas straight to the Pacific Ocean and be bounded only by its rolling wave. It is the destiny of the white race. It is the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon race. The American Slavery Society, on the other hand, said the war was, quote, waged solely for the detestable and horrible purposes of extending and perpetuating American slavery throughout the vast territory of Mexico, unquote. A 27-year-old Boston poet and abolitionist, James Russell Lowell, began writing satirical poems in the Boston Courier. They were later collected as the Biglow Papers, and then a New England farmer, Hosea Biglow, spoke in his own dialect on the war. Is fair war a cold matter? There you have it plain and flat. I don't want to go no further than my testament for that. They may talk o' freedom's eyrie till they are purple in the face. It's a grand great cemetery. From the birthrights of our race, they just want this California. South to log a new slave state in, to abuse ye, and to scorn ye, and to plunder ye like sin. The war had barely begun, the summer of 1846, when a writer Henry David Thoreau, who lived in Concord, Massachusetts, refused to pay his Massachusetts poll tax. Denouncing the Mexican War, he was put in jail and spent one night there. His friends, without his consent, paid his tax, and he was released. 2 years later, he gave a lecture, quote, Resistance to Civil Government, which was then printed as an essay, quote, Civil Disobedience. It is not desirable to cultivate the respect for the law so as much for the right. Law never made men a whit more just, and by the means of their respect for it, even the well-deposed are daily made the agents of injustice. A common natural result of an undue respect for law is that you may see a file of soldiers marching in admirable order over hill and dale to this wars, against their wills, aye, against their common sense and consciousness, which makes it very steep marching indeed and produces a palpitation of the heart. His friends and fellow writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, agreed but thought it futile to protest. When Emerson visited Thoreau in jail and asked, quote, What are you doing in that? It was reported to Thoreau that replied, What are you doing out there? End quote. The churches, for the most part, were either outspokenly for the war or timidly silent. Generally but no one, but the Congregational, Quaker, and Unitarian churches spoke clearly against the war. However, one Baptist minister, the Reverend Francis Wayland, president of Brown University, gave 3 sermons at the University Chapel in which he said that only wars of self-defense were just, and in case of unjust war, the individual is morally obligated to resist it and lend money to no money to the government to support it. The Reverend Theodore Parker, Unitarian minister in Boston, combined eloquent criticism of the war with contempt for the Mexican people, which he called, quote, a wretched people, wretching in their origin, history, and character. Who must eventually give way, as the Indians did. Yes, the United States should expand, he said, but not by war, rather by the power of her ideas, the pressure of her commerce, by, quote, the steady advance of a superior race with superior ideas and a better civilization. By being better than Mexico, wiser, humaner, more free, and manly, end quote. Parker urged active resistance to the war in 1847, quote, Let it be infamous for New England man to enlist, for New Englander merchant to loan his dollars, or to be let his ship to aid of his wrecked war. Let it be infamous for manufacturer to make a cannon, a sword, or a kernel powder to kill our brothers. End quote. The racism of Parker was widespread. Congressman Delano of Ohio, an anti-slavery Whig, opposed the war because he was afraid of Americans mingling with an inherent inferior people who quote, embrace all shades of color, a sad compound of Spanish, English, Indian, and Negro bloods, and resulting, as it is said, in the production of a slothful, ignorant race of beings. End quote. As the war went on, and opposition grew, the American Peace Society printed a newspaper, The Advocate of Peace, which published poems, speeches, petitions, sermons against the war, and eyewitness accounts of the degradation of army life and the horrors of battle. The abolitionists, speaking through William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, denounced the war as one, quote, of aggression, of invasion, of conquest, of rapine, marked by ruffianism, perfidy, and every other feature of national depravity, end quote. Considering the strenuous efforts of the nation's leaders to build patriotic support, the amount of open dissent and criticism was remarkable. Anti-war meetings took place in spite of Mexican attacks by patriotic mobs. As the army moved closer to Mexico City, the liberator daringly declared its wishes for the defeat of the American forces. Quote, every lover of freedom and humanity throughout the world must wish them, the Mexicans, the most triumphant success. We only hope that if blood he has to flow, that has been that of the Americans, and that the next news we shall hear will be the great General Scott and his army are in the banks of Mexico. We wish him and his troops no bodily harm, but the most utter defeat and disgrace. Frederick Douglass, former slave, extraordinary speaker and writer, wrote in his Rochester newspaper, the North Star, January 21st, 1848, of quote, the present disgraceful, cruel, and inquisitive war with our sister republic. Mexico seems a doomed victim to Anglo-Saxon cupidity of love of dominating, unquote. Douglass was scornful of the willingness of opponents of the war to take real action. Even the abolitionists kept paying their taxes. The determination of the slave-holding president to prosecute the war and the probability of success and wringing from the people, from men and women, money to carry it on, is made evident rather than doubtful by the puny opposition arrayed against him. No politician of any considerable distinction or eminence seems willing to hazard his popularity with his party. By an open, unqualified disapprobation of the war, no one seemed willing to take their stand for peace at all risks, and all seemed willing that the war should be carried on in some form or another. Where was popular opinion? It is hard to say. After the first rush, enlistments began to dwindle. In 1846, elections showed much anti-Polk sentiment, but who could tell how much of this war was due to the war? In Massachusetts, Congressman Robert Winthrop, who had voted for the war, was elected overwhelmingly against an anti-war Whig. Shorter concludes that although Polk's popularity fell, quote, general enthusiasm for the Mexican War remained high, end quote. But this is the guess. There were no surveys of public opinion at the time. As for voting, a majority of the people did not vote at all. And how did these non-voters feel about the war? Historians of the Mexican War have talked easily about, quote, the people and, quote, public opinion. Like Justin H. Smith, whose 2-volume work, The War in Mexico, has long been a standard account. Quote, of course, too, all the pressure of a warlike sentiment among my people had been recognized more or less, for such is the nature of popular government. Smith's evidence, however, is not from the people, but from the newspapers, claiming to be the voice of the people. The New York Herald wrote in August 1845, quote, the multitude cry aloud for the war. And the New York Journal of Commerce, half playfully, half seriously wrote, quote, let us go to war, end quote. The world has become stale and insipid. The ships ought to be all captured, and cities battered down, and the world burned up, so we can start again. There would be fun in that. Some interest, something to talk about. The New York Morning News said, quote, young and ardent spirits that throng the cities, but at a direction to the restless energies, and their attention is already fixed on Mexico, end quote. Were the newspapers reporting a feeling in the public, or creating a feeling in the public, or manufacturing consent? Those reporting this feeling, like Justin Smith, themselves expressed strong views about the need for war. Smith, who dedicates his book to Henry Cabot Lodge, one of the ultra-expansionists of American history, makes a long list of Mexican sins against the United States, and ends by saying, quote, it rested with our government. Therefore, as the agent of national dignity and interest to apply a remedy. He comments on folks, call for war, quote, in truth no other course would have been patriotic or even rational. It is impossible to know the extent of popular support of the war, but there is evidence that many organized working men opposed the war. Earlier, when the annexation of Texas was being considered, working men meeting in New England protested the annexation. A newspaper in Manchester, New Hampshire wrote, we have heretofore held our peace in regarding the annexation of Texas, for the purpose of seeing whether our nation would attempt to so base an action. We call it base, because it be giving men that live upon the blood of others an opportunity of dipping their hand still deeper in the sin of slavery. Have we not slaves? Enough now? There were demonstrations of Irish workers in New York Boston and Lowell against the annexation of Texas. Philip Foner reports in May, when the war against Mexico began, New York workingmen called a meeting to oppose the war, and many Irish workers came. The meeting called the war a plot by slave owners and asked for the withdrawal of the American troops from disputed territory. That year, a convention of the New England Workingmen's Association condemned the war, and announced they would, quote, not take up arms to sustain the Slavic slavery holder and robbing 1/5 of our countrymen and their labor, end quote. Some newspapers at the very start of the war protested. Horace Greeley wrote in the New York Tribune, May 12, 1846, "We can easily defeat the armies of Mexico, slaughter them by thousands, and pursue them perhaps to their capital. We can concur and, quote, annex their territory. But what then? Have the histories of the ruin of Greek and Roman liberty conquest, consequent, and such extensions of empire by the sword, no lesson for us, who please at a source of victories over Mexico, the quote annexation of half the provinces, will give us more liberty, a pure morality, a more prosperous industry than we have now? It's not life miserable enough? Comes not death soon enough, without resort to the hideous enginery of war?" That's a great question. A lot of these are great questions. But thank you guys for watching. This is part 1. Part 2 will probably come tomorrow or sometime later this week. Always feel free to leave your thoughts below and any thoughts or considerations. But other than that, I hope you guys have a great day.